Moment, please. Okay, and welcome everyone. I'm Sharon Streams. I'm the Director of Strategy and Operations for CALMA, the Center for Advances in Libraries and Museums and Archives. And welcome today to the second ever CALMA Round Table. That's when machine learning meets cultural heritage collections. And your host, as I mentioned, is CALMA. If you haven't checked out the center, here's the link to the website, and we hope that you will continue to be involved with our events like this. So today's speakers we have a panel of five who will be kind of anchoring the roundtable discussion. We have high school assistant professors Ben Lee and Melanie Walsh. We have David Christensen from Seattle Public Library. We have Lucy Havens and Connor Ray, who's at assessment librarian at San Diego State University. And Lucy, I should mention, is currently a research affiliate at the Center for Data, Culture, and Society at the University of Edinburgh. So thank you so much for making the trip all the way on site, and I'm glad to see some people in the room. And like I said, there's quite a number, a couple dozen people online already. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to the roundtable to get things started.
Do we have an order?
Good question.
Why don't we start with, if we could, well, there was the order, sort of how we described it in the events, but I know that Ben has slides today, right? And Melanie, did you have slides as well?
I also have slides, yes.
Okay, so maybe we should start with a slide, slide one first, and then maybe do a non-slide and another slide one.
Sounds good. Okay.
Do you want to go? Do you want me to go? I'm happy to go.
Let me go.
Okay. So let me share my screen. Okay. So thanks so much to all of you for being here, and those of you who are online, thank you for being here. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about my work that I've been doing with Connor Ray, who's my former MLIS student, MLIS graduate, and who's now a librarian at San Diego State University. We're very proud of them. And we have another collaborator on this project, Tina Nowak. So I also want to give shout out to Tina. So we've been working on this project for the last couple of years, investigating data-driven diversity audits, or DEI audits, of public library collections. So we've been doing research and interviews with librarians and vendors. We've been digging into some library purchasing records, and at some point we hope to do a computational audit of some of these audits as well, which I could talk a little bit more about later. I think our primary goal in this work has been to understand how these kinds of computational services are getting integrated into libraries. But I think a looming question that is relevant for today's broader conversation might be, is it possible and desirable to measure diversity in library collections with computational and AI tools? So first, to back up a bit and provide some background, these diversity audits are responding to a growing awareness of systemic inequities in libraries, library collections, and the mainstream publishing industry, which supplies most books in library collections. A recent study led by Richard Jean So, and pictured, one of the data visualizations from that study is pictured here, showed that more than 95% of books published by the big five publishers over the last 60 years were written by white authors. And this suggests that library collections are also made up of works by predominantly white authors. These inequities not only fall along lines of race and ethnicity, but also sexuality, gender, ability, language, and more. And they're not only biased in terms of authors' identities, but also in terms of the kinds of stories, perspectives, and ideas that are represented too. At the same time that many libraries have recognized that they need to increase the diversity of their collections, there has also been widespread public pushback in the form of book bannings and challenges and legislation, accusing library collections of in fact being too diverse, too woke. Oftentimes that's what they're accusing. So in this charged moment, it's become clear to many libraries that at the very least, they need to take stock of their collections. And while some libraries have begun to do this kind of work manually, manual audits are incredibly time-consuming, labor-intensive, and expensive, especially when trying to evaluate a large collection that could include tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of items. So to address this problem, since 2021, corporate library vendors, including Baker and Taylor, Ingram, Overdrive, and others, have begun to offer computational, data-driven DEI audits of library collections, usually taking advantage of the fact that they already have access to a library's catalog. These companies run an analysis of the collection and then give the library reports and data visualizations about how diverse their collection is overall, something like the pie chart that is pictured here, how it compares to the average library, and also how it fares in different specific categories. So you can see here, Asian interests, Black interests, Indigenous, Jewish, Latinx, LGBTQIA, mental health, Middle Eastern, multicultural, Muslim, neuro, and physical diversity. And some of these categories depend on the vendor. They also provide shopping lists of diverse books that libraries can purchase to improve diversity in these different categories, which of course are books being sold by the vendor. And that's really where the vendors seem to be making money here, although some of them do charge for the audits themselves. So there's a lot that we can say about these audits, and Connor's going to talk a little bit more, and hopefully we're going to talk more in the discussion. But one thing I wanted to flag is this big question of how are these vendors actually measuring diversity? So most of these tools are measuring diversity by evaluating whether a given title includes certain BISAC headings, sometimes Library of Congress headings, and they're also determining if a title falls into a special list that has been curated by the vendors. But the catch is that they don't say which specific headings they use for different categories, and they don't say which books are on what list and why. And of course, they're not sharing this information because this is basically their business model. But this lack of transparency about the method and the data is problematic. We think libraries should be able to have a say in what counts as diversity in their collection, or at the very least in knowing what counts as diversity in these reports. And this transparency is only going to become more urgent as these approaches begin to incorporate LLMs and AI, which we know from our research is already on the horizon. And I think Connor's going to talk a little bit more about. The last thing I'll say, though, one thing that's come out of the interviews that has been really interesting is that a lot of librarians and libraries, while being aware of some of these issues, have nonetheless found these audits to be useful. And I think that's in large part because it's offering information that they just wouldn't be able to get otherwise. So I think there's sort of a tension here in that there are parts of this service that are not, what librarians would hope that they would be, and yet at the same time they seem to be still serving a purpose to these libraries. So I'll pass it over to Connor.
Yeah, so one of the data sources that we looked at in particular that I think we both found to stand in contrast to those offered by vendors is one that is based off of a IMLS-funded grant project. It's a collaboration between professors, librarians, teachers, to compile a data set of diverse books. They have a pretty large data set. They claim a comprehensive collection of all depictions of BIPOC communities in mainstream children's literature since 2002. So it's going to be a big chunk of most public library collections. But what stands in contrast to those being offered by library vendors, which tend to solely view diversity through a more quantitative approach, looking at instances of subject headings to indicate a sense of diverse representation in a book. There's a very robust data collection process that's a part of this this collection of this data set that involves selectors who find these books that are being published by the mainstream publishing industry. They're then sent off to coders who will read these books in their entirety and code books not only on instances of diverse representation, but also they collect or they categorize books based off of common themes. This was something that was developed through the creation of this data set was sort of, I think, a group of about 12 common themes that are seen in children's literature, things like biography, stories where the BIPOC identity of a character is central to the themes of a book versus one where it is incidental to the themes of the book. They also have more in-depth content tags, including sensitive topic tags that might be relevant for librarian selectors. They collect tags on the main characters of books, including race, ethnicity, but also gender, sexual orientation, disability. So collecting a lot more robust data, and they are also crucially collect information when available on the lived experience of the creator of these books when the creator discloses that information. So coders will read the book, collect that information, and then pass it off to a releaser who then reviews that coding, make sure it is up to the standards they set, and then publishes it on their publicly available website where it is a free resource for librarians, teachers, researchers to gain access to. It's not open access necessarily, you do still need to request access, but I do think it provides a more broad and deep approach to a diversity audit to get a sense at what kinds of stories are being told generally, both in any given library's collection, but as well as in the publishing industry in general. As Melanie mentioned, this is largely getting at a systemic issue that we are seeing in the publishing industry, which centers whiteness and its practices and the kinds of stories it's pushing out into the world. And I think this data set gets at a more granular look at what kinds of stories are starting to be told and where are the gaps that can be filled in. The person we talked to talked about using large language models as a way to augment this process, to sort of take a first draft at the coders work that people are doing. So analyzing the text of new books and providing these tags that a person would then still look over and review. I don't want to say expedite the process because it doesn't necessarily sound like it would make it quicker, but sort of add an additional step. I think a concern that I have, and Melanie and I have talked about, is the use of large language models or just the use of these data sets in general for more nefarious purposes, for targeting books in collections, using something like Notebook LM to identify which books in the collection are considered diverse for purposes of reading, etc. Yeah, I'm saying.
Yeah, no, so I mean, those were some of our more recent conversations about people being interested in LLMs and AI, and I just think that's like the trajectory of these kinds of audits.
Yeah.
So the main audits that like I was describing, there's not really like a machine learning dimension of that work, but I think that there will be, and I think, yeah, that's something that I would love to talk more about with everybody. Thank you. So Sharon suggested going from slide to no slide? Or going from slide to slide?
Well, I was thinking, maybe Lucy would based on what you said your remarks were going to be, might be a nice segue from what we just heard. Does that sound good? Okay.
Yeah, that sounds great. I was just making a note about the LLM thing because that is very relevant to what I've been doing. So I'm Lucy Havens. I recently finished a PhD at the University of Edinburgh and have been working as kind of an independent researcher and consultant since then, started my own business. And my research interests lie at kind of the intersection of human data interaction and cultural heritage. And I've been thinking specifically about social biases in data and their implications for information discovery and data-driven decision-making, and exactly the kind of application that the last panelist just closed with, kind of using large language models, for example, to can perform large-scale analysis on collections. And what I kind of started off with was looking at archives at the University of Edinburgh And more recently, I've been working with Newcastle University to think specifically about gender biases in the catalog metadata descriptions that are documenting the contents of collections and historical events and people that are represented in or relevant to those collection items. And I've been interested specifically in working with catalog metadata because although there's more and more information available digitally, still the majority of collections in most libraries, archives, and museums aren't available digitally. So the best kind of comprehensive view we can get is what's in a catalog. And of course, the catalog metadata is also how somebody can discover these collections in the first place. So they can really have, the descriptions can have quite a significant influence on what a person finds, but also how they begin to interpret the material before they even see it for themselves. And there's been growing interest among information heritage professionals in revisiting old catalog descriptions that use kind of outdated language that we wouldn't use today to describe certain material. But it's a very manually intensive process. And of course, there's always new material coming in. And so trying to balance the need to update or add additional context to older descriptions with describing new material ends up, kind of dividing up resources that are already kind of scarce in a lot of these institutions. So there's a good use case for machine learning and specifically natural language processing here in trying to better understand the catalog metadata descriptions at large scale. But the problem is, and kind of the challenge with this, is that heritage and information professionals think about bias in a very different way than most data and computer scientists that are building machine learning models, and especially the most kind of widely used and widely known models that are out there. Very broadly speaking, among heritage and information professionals, bias is something that's considered more dynamic and context specific, and something that needs to be managed rather than something that can be removed. And I think there's also a kind of acknowledgement that in a cultural heritage context, removing bias is kind of erasing evidence of injustice that is what motivates kind of improvements and change in society. And so removing bias in a social media context is very different from removing bias in a library context. Among data and computer scientists, there is more of this emphasis on just removing bias, and there's been a lot more work focused on trying to identify and remove bias for models and data than there has been on actually understanding what the bias is and the different ways it comes through in data, which in my mind is part of why there's been pretty limited progress in actually addressing bias in these models, because it's pretty difficult to remove something if you don't really know what you're looking for or you only partially understand it. So what I've been trying to do is look at approaches and practices in libraries, archives, and information sciences, and bring those together with practices in data and computer science to better understand bias and start characterizing how it can manifest in data and really start to tease out some of these complexities that are being missed in the kind of predominant approach to bias in machine learning. So before I go too much further, I will say bias can mean a lot of different things. It's very subjective. So there are kind of two main types of bias that I think about at a high level. So one is misrepresentation, so things like a stereotype or derogatory language, or even just a simple inaccuracy. And then omissions as well. So sometimes these are referred to more as exclusions or silences, but it can be like the complete absence of a person or not really doing justice to a person's contribution. So in archives, it's quite common to see a woman described in relation to her father or her husband rather than kind of her own identity as a person. So by bringing together computational and qualitative human-centered research methods, I've been working on creating machine learning models that can identify different types of gender biases in catalog metadata descriptions. And then I've been also kind of with that working on creating an evaluation approach that considers the kind of context-specific nature of this data and is complementing the more kind of statistical evaluation methods that are more common in natural language processing and machine learning. And so through that work, I've started to be able to characterize three different ways that bias can manifest in catalog metadata descriptions. And one of these is how the heritage material is described, so the word choice, quite straightforward. Some of it's about the choices of what detail to include and exclude about heritage material. And then there can also be descriptions that simply are reflecting biases in the heritage material itself. So it's something that is just inevitably going to be documented if you're documenting this as a heritage collection. And what I've been emphasizing as I do this work is that I'm not trying to put the blame on the individual who's writing these descriptions. The biases are rooted in systemic issues that extend beyond the kind of profession of a librarian, archivist, or curator. And there are also a lot of factors at play in terms of the amount of time that is available to someone to write these descriptions and kind of do the research into the people represented in a heritage collection that can influence the detail that ends up being included or excluded. Catalogers in general, the people writing these descriptions, also feel a much greater sense of responsibility to the public than you often see in the kind of rhetoric coming out of machine learning and AI communities when it comes to really wanting to commit to improving the information discovery process. So there are many ways that these descriptions can also be used to push back against the kind of hegemonic cultural and historical narratives that we have. So, for example, sometimes descriptions will explicitly acknowledge biases in material, and sometimes by choosing, again, the kind of detail to include about a collection, you can actually draw attention to the ways that somebody was kind of working to establish more equitable societal power relationships. So for anyone building and using machine learning, what I've been starting to try to do is think a little bit beyond the cultural heritage sector as well and articulate why bias is so complex and difficult to address. And so through some workshops I've run with heritage and information professionals, I've been able to kind of tease out what some of these things are. So one being that sometimes addressing one type of bias can end up introducing a different type of bias. And so there are different communities that might disagree about how they want to be represented. And it's difficult to please everyone. So again, it's a very context specific issue. In many ways, bias is inevitable. And bias can also be useful in that it can provide historical insights into how a person would have moved through society and the sorts of barriers that they would have faced or the opportunities that they would have had. And so it's been interesting to think about how, as people think about how to adjust description practices or update older catalog descriptions, a lot of it is more about adding information and adding additional context than it is about changing the language or removing anything. So yeah, I'll just kind of end by saying that all this is really kind of led me to start to put together frameworks for more qualitative, human-centered, and context-specific approaches to developing machine learning models and the way that their data sets are evaluated and their performance is evaluated, and really pushing back against this idea that you can have artificial general intelligence or the sort of universal one-size-fits-all model or debiasing approach that it really needs to be. We need to approach this work in a way that's grounded in very specific real-world use cases. And when we think about the performance of models, we should be thinking about the bias in them as well. Often that's considered kind of a separate thing to measure than just the accuracy of a model. And I think we need to start bringing those things together. Well, in there. Thank you. Do we want to go to a slide deck?
That sounds great to me. That sounds good to you, Sharon.
That's perfect.
Sounds great. Let me go ahead and share my slide deck. Also, somehow I think I managed to delete a couple of slides by accident. That's why I was poking around here. I think I've restored it, but apologies if I seem slightly more flustered than usual. Okay. I've gone ahead and I think should be good. I'll start a timer here. Well, first off, thank you so much to Sharon and David for organizing this wonderful event and to be included. It's really a joy to be in this conversation with panelists and to see so many CALMA affiliates here and also to see so many new names as well. So thank you for including me. With my 10 minutes here, I want to talk about this general idea of computing cultural heritage that I think is rather central to my work and naturally, I think fits into the questions of this panel around what happens when we apply machine learning and computation more generally to digital collections. And I'll sort of refine this a little bit more in particular to go toward questions around what this means for search and discovery in terms of what we do when we actually are trying to navigate a collection. I'll mention a little bit that my work has spanned other portions of this question at the intersection of AI and digital collections. I've done some work sort of developing checklists for practitioners, developing cultural heritage projects related to, or when they apply machine learning, I should say. I've also started some work with the Digital Public Library of America surrounding public libraries and their uses of AI, in particular developing AI guidelines. We've been working with the Akron Public Library and the Toronto Public Library more closely surrounding all of this, and this is in its sort of early stages. And lastly, I'll mention that there's this whole other dimension to AI and cultural heritage that seems to be rather increasingly important here, which is how we actually, excuse me, begin to preserve AI as its own sort of cultural artifact. And I've been really fortunate to do some work with literary scholar Andrew Dean around the novelist J.M. Coetzee's really early computer-generated poetry. And so here's a publication, anti-apartheid publication called Staff Writer that Coetzee was publishing in the 60s, his papers at UT Austin at the Harry Ransom Center, where he actually had his sort of dot matrix paper of Fortran code. And we've been able to sort of reanimate this code, get it functioning so people can generate their own Coetzee poems, and also sort of ask these broader questions around what it means to preserve AI as cultural artifacts. But for the purposes of the remaining 8 minutes, I want to talk about search and discovery in particular, as I had mentioned, and how it relates to digital collections and the broader theme of this panel. So much of my work asks with these sort of larger collections, on the left here showing digitized newspapers, on the right showing web archives, how we might begin to approach the question of scale computationally, recognizing that these newspaper collections span tens of millions of pages. The web archives that we encounter are billions of web page snapshots and petabytes of data that present really just fundamental computational challenges around the producing metadata, the kind of limitations that we encounter with having humans produce finding aids, and also just recognizing the kinds of just data storage issues and then sort of machine learning affordances we have to build on top. And rather notably, we've encountered versions of this in the archives. We use them already in the form of, say, optical character recognition, or OCR for short, where given a page of typewritten text or handwritten text, even these days, we can get back using machine learning some sort of usable transcription that allows us to do keyword search, to do textual analysis, and really unlocks a lot of these digital approaches that are so central to the iSchool. And we know that OCR is imperfect. I think this is something we've all encountered doing work in the archive in one way or another. Here's an example I like to show of 4 photos of W.E.B. Du Bois from Black newspapers from 1910, an article about the crisis, the official publication of the NAACP. I bring this up because we see how OCR is really heavily mediated by the materiality of the page. Here are 4 different photographs with different ink level saturations, also different questions around microfilming settings. And what we find is not only is the OCR imperfect, but it's actually being transmuted differently in each of the 4 photos. And so this means that this isn't just a computational question. As per the theme that we've just raised, there are all sorts of biases intruding, and this extends to all sorts of languages that we find are non-OCRable. One example of my own work is the Ladino language. University of Washington here has a really vibrant Sephardic studies community, and one of the challenges that scholars really persistently face is how to work with the digitized newspapers and even do basic things like keyword search. So all just to say that I think on the one hand, computation presents all these opportunities, but also presents all these questions around unevenness and discoverability and how we might begin to think about these, and also maybe have attention to other more canonical methods like close reading and other kinds of archival practices. But more generally, I think machine learning here is at this crux of this question of how we explore, make sense of, and analyze these kinds of collections at scale. And in the context of my own work, a sort of roadmap that I found to be rather instructive for the work that I hope to do as well is to think how we can go from sort of scanned newspaper pages or digitized collections and begin to enrich the metadata, build out new affordances for searching, and put these kinds of systems in front of real users, understand their interaction patterns, limitations that they face, and use that as an opportunity to then iterate and build new systems. So this is a schematic for a project that I did with the Library of Congress called Newspaper Navigator. It is one that I'm really interested in extending to different kinds of collections. So beyond newspaper pages, thinking about it, say, in the context of web archives, much of my work now is surrounding the challenges rather fundamentally that emerged with foreign digital document collections. Here working with web archives, specifically around .gov domain websites like state.gov, USDA.gov. We recognize that being able to search these kinds of government disclosure documents, especially PDFs or other kinds of document formats, is rather essential to journalistic practice, to social science research, to the humanities as well. There's a lot of really interesting historiographic work taking place by Ian Milligan and other scholars around the importance of web archives in historical research. But my question is, sort of given the fact that we have the challenge of accessing web archives, how might machine learning present us an opportunity to overcome some of these fundamental limitations in metadata, going beyond basic keyword search, going beyond the kinds of just basic URL lookups that we have? And so much of my work now is asking this question of how we can begin to scale up these systems to use these emerging sort of multimodal machine learning models to improve our sort of semantic understanding of PDF pages or more generally web archives to allow us to scale this up. And of course, we're encountering challenges here around data management, around sort of interactivity in a machine learning perspective, and also just how to, all just to say that dealing with petabytes of data and making it searchable, of course, is not a new problem, but also one that does present all sorts of challenges in its own right. So just to say that I think at this intersection of machine learning and cultural heritage, it's not just a question of sort of, as oftentimes framed, I think in a rather unfortunate way from computer scientists about a sort of one-dimensional direction about how machine learning can be applied. Rather, I think in the context of web archives, we actually have a challenge or an opportunity to sort of inform our understanding of machine learning and the affordances that can be developed. But also, I'd like to really explore this work beyond web archives and continue to work in digitized materials and other sorts of digital collections that present all sorts of, I think, really fundamental and interesting opportunities to reimagine how we sort of animate digital archives. So I've been really fortunate to work with a photojournalist by the name of Chris Moritz, who has been digitizing his own archive and going through this rather powerful process of having sent off for many decades of his life these film photos that he had taken, sent to his editors at Time and other publications, where they would go through the editorial process of selecting which photos would be ultimately published. But he's having this process of now getting all these photos back in his archive and re-digitizing them and having rather moving experience and painful experiences of encountering these, re-encountering or re-experiencing these very traumatic events, war photography, other contexts, and recording himself doing this. And so what we're interested in is asking beyond machine learning, how might we be able to bring together approaches for moral history, where he's sharing about his understanding of his own materials, and merge them with questions around discoverability and real challenges of metadata and just limitations that he himself faces as he digitizes his own archive. So I know I've sort of touched on a number of diffuse sort of components here, but thought that maybe this would sort of at least give some ideas or some provocations around how machine learning might intersect with different dimensions of digital collections in my own work. But I will end with sort of few ideas that I see as the important sort of guiding principles that I see behind this kind of work. And the first for me is that navigating and making sense of the cultural heritage collections that we're all talking about presents really distinctly interdisciplinary challenges. I think understanding the backgrounds of all of us on the panel, we have different disciplinary trainings and all bring something new to this conversation. And so here, developing new approaches in library and information science, machine learning, digital humanities in order to navigate and make sense of these collections is really important to this work. And of course, foregrounding ethical stewardship of doing this is incredibly important to the work. And I want to make sure that I recognize the time limitations and not to say that this is just a sort of hand-waving notion of doing this ethically and responsibly, but I invite that conversation as part of the discussion that I'm sure we'll have in a bit here. I'll go ahead and stop there in the interest of time and go ahead and turn it over, but thank you. Oh, I guess I'll use that. Sorry, I do have one more slide, which is, I guess, an important one for myself. For students, please feel free to reach out if you're interested in doing work. So all of you affiliated with CALMA, please do reach out. I'm starting the lab, so excited to work with you all. On that note, I will actually stop.
It's great. So maybe we'll close with David.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Christensen. Before I start, I thought I would ask, has anyone read something recently that they enjoyed and would be willing to share with us? Yes, go ahead.
I read The Birch Bark House by Louise Erdrich.
Oh, she's great.
Could you tell us a little bit about what you liked about the book?
Ooh, I like the seasonality of it. but it takes you through the course of like a whole year, and so you experience the year with the family that's centered in the book.
Thank you so much. My name is David Christensen. I want to talk to you about reading suggestions and machine learning. I'm a public librarian working at the Seattle Public Library. And when it comes to reading suggestions, or in fact, just deciding what to read, it's often influenced by a mix of personal values and emotional states. We may gravitate towards a specific title, style, or mood, and it can be tricky to find exactly what resonates with the reader. And when you finish a book, you don't necessarily want to read a book that's exactly like the book that you just read. So, imagine that you've just read the four-book series by Robert Caro on Lyndon B. Johnson. Perhaps once you finish the fourth book, I think it's The Passage of Power is the last one, 2012. You don't necessarily want to read another biography about Lyndon Johnson next, if ever again. So, likely the reader is looking for something different, but not too different. It's kind of a Goldilocks principle of, you want something similar, not too similar, just the right balance. Public libraries offer personalized reading suggestions. For example, at my library, we offer something called Your Next 5, where you fill out an online form to request reading suggestions. The librarians respond with recommendations based on your stated interests. Experienced Readers Advisory librarians are great at matching patrons with the books they might enjoy, but there are known constraints to doing this at scale. Quality Readers Advisory can be time-consuming. We don't typically advertise the Your Next 5 service. We rely on people to find the link on our website. And it can take 3 or 4 days to receive a reply after making a request. And that works fine for many people, but not everyone. Some people want something right away. And not everyone is comfortable sharing their reading preferences. Explaining why they want a certain type of book may be difficult, and they can feel embarrassed or uncomfortable expressing their reading choices. These are not reasons to do away with the current service at all. I love Your Next 5, but rather an opportunity to consider alternatives. One alternative would be to provide low-stakes, passive reading suggestions by leveraging reading history and machine learning. Using library data, I've experimented with machine learning techniques to recommend books to patrons based on item-based collaborative filtering. This includes the use of cosine similarity with a sparse matrix in the R language environment to predict books that people might enjoy. There were a lot of words that I just said. So let me give an example of what that would be. So imagine you have friends over and you're going to choose something to watch on Netflix. And some of you like action movies, some of you like romance, some of you like documentaries. You're going to pick a movie that one of your friends has already watched, who has watched the most movies in common as you, and who also hasn't seen too many movies that you haven't seen. And so to do this, you have each of your friends log into their Netflix account, and they write down exactly all the movies they've ever seen. And then you set up an algorithm to give each friend a similarity score of sorts. This is essentially what cosine similarity does. It looks at the angle between two vectors. In this example, vectors means the list of movies a given friend has watched or not watched, and the vector of movies that you've watched or not watched. If the two vectors point in the same direction, they're very similar, and if they're pointing in completely different directions, they're not similar at all. Now, if we represent these lists as points of multidimensional data, like in a big matrix, cosine similarity can help us measure how close these points are together. So applied to the universe of readers and the universe of books, cosine similarity can help highlight titles other people have checked out who may have very similar reading interests to your own tastes. So modeling cosine similarity can be pretty straightforward. The simplest model would be to represent titles with ones and zeros for whether or not you have read it. But there are opportunities to introduce greater complexity and model other types of data about the book within the cosine similarity model. There are other approaches to constructing recommendation systems, maybe using a neural network or using a large language model. However, I want to highlight some of the advantages to using cosine similarity over one of these more complex models. Large language models can be costly, even with reasonably priced API fees. As you scale up, if you're making multiple API calls for every single library user, it can start to get expensive. In contrast, cosine similarity is much more cost effective in that you're relying on existing data and it doesn't require heavy computational resources. Another thing that kind of came to mind when thinking about LLMs versus using something like cosine similarity is that reading interests tend to have a local flavor. So, for example, libraries often feature local authors, and our data shows that the patrons in Seattle check out guidebooks about our local area more than they do guidebooks about other areas. And so you would want a recommendation system that accounts for people's local preferences. That sort of thing can be done with an LLM, but you're introducing complexity to something that doesn't need to be complex. So cosine similarity, on the other hand, will naturally accommodate these local tastes based on the specific community of data that you have. So why haven't libraries done this? Why haven't public libraries done this already? The primary difficulty in implementing such a system lies in accessing relevant data while maintaining user privacy. Libraries must strike a balance between utilizing patron information to improve services and protecting individual privacy rights. Our official data sets obfuscate user de-identified title level checkouts. This means that the title level data and the de-identified user data exist in separate tables that cannot be joined together. Libraries should collect data to improve services effectively while also taking precautions to protect user privacy. If a library has a secure internal data system, I recommend the use of a de-identified ID to represent users along with title level checkout metadata. This data can then be modeled for publication as anonymous checkout history vectors. That's really all I had to say, but I've got a little paragraph that's like sums up what I said, but I'll just skip that and say thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I don't know if Sharon has anything else to say, but I think we're at the moment where we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, either on Zoom or here in person. Yeah, Paul?
Yeah, I have, by the way, all of those are very interesting presentation. Thank you. I have a question for you, Professor and Connor, and also to Sir Christensen. I'm thinking that the kinds of studies or projects that you're doing can also lead to like profiling libraries that are serving DEI communities, or it's a reflection of the patrons they're serving. So my question is, what safeguards do you think needs to be in place or are currently in place for such report features to not be used against the public libraries and its patrons?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We've been talking about that just recently because, yeah, this project we've been working on it on and off for the last 2 years. And even just after the national election last week, like the environment is changing. The political environment is changing. And so, yeah, we've been reaching out to more libraries. We've talked to people from Indiana and Oregon and some people in Washington, but we wanted to talk to more libraries with more diverse communities, potentially like in the South or in Florida. And those are some of the places that are like especially under attack right now, and even have, legislation being passed that is making it, like not allowing them to explicitly pursue diversity goals. So like, I think that's made it, a couple of the people that we've reached out to have said like they don't want to talk to us. So I think it's made people reluctant to even have a conversation about how diversity audits are being used or considered at their libraries. I think in terms of like the safeguards about reports, I don't think a library has to make it publicly available that they've done a diversity audit. I don't know, I'd be curious to like hear David's perspective on this, but I definitely think it's a concern. Although one really interesting thing that we learned was that a library in Indiana, they did a diversity audit to sort of show that their collection was not too woke. So it was actually in response to those critiques, and they were like, we're not crazy. We don't have these wildly leftist books. Like we're 13% diverse or whatever. I don't know if Connor has other thoughts to add.
No, I think that sums it up pretty well. I think, I guess in terms of like safeguarding the data, pretty much all of it right now is proprietary data. So it's sort of effectively safeguarded just for like those data sets being offered by those data sets and tools being offered by vendors are behind paywall a lot of the time. And then the one that is free for libraries to use, that's offered by the IMLS funded grant project, that one, you still have to request access for it. So there is sort of a screening process. I'm not sure what that all entails, but I think the folks behind that are interested in, I think they understand how sensitive that data is and how it could be misused.
I just wanted to share your questions.
Oh yeah, but I'm curious, can it be bought by third party if it's owned by the proprietor?
I don't think so. Not the
Like the data about like the
diversity audit.
the headings or like the actual findings from the audit. I don't think that, well, I guess maybe it could be part of a public records request. I don't know. Do you know, David?
In Washington State, that seems likely, yeah.
So yeah, it seems like it could. And again, like I've been really excited about the idea of like somebody or like us making like an open source audit, like, where we could have our own, like you could pick your subject headings and you could, a kind of a tool sort of like the IMLS grant funded one. But I think, it could be used to target libraries because it could be used to say, you have too many diverse books, etc. So it seems very complicated.
We have a question online that also, I didn't know if there was someone speaking in the room, but Cindy has a question from the Zoom room.
Okay, there was somebody who was about to ask a question, but
go ahead, I'll wait. It's okay.
Okay, thank you, Cindy, for your patience. Do you want to ask?
Of course.
Yeah, I'm wondering, with all of the sort of data pieces of this, how concerned you all are of like outside hacks. Like that happens quite a bit, not necessarily in libraries, but like in general. And if you're collecting additional data from people, even if it's to do something like you said about like how, your next 5 books or all of this stuff, if you're getting deeper and deeper into that, how worried or what the library is thinking about in terms of that data is now like more easily accessible in terms of hackers or people who are trying to do nefarious things.
Yeah, that great question. So I work at the Seattle Public Library, which on May 25th suffered a cyber attack where all of our IT infrastructures were exposed until they were taken offline. The full extent of what has happened is still being reviewed. What I would suggest was the publication of anonymized vectors of checkout data. So we're just talking about title linked together, not who. So in an anonymous sense, that's what the publication would be. As far as an exposure like the event that happened on May 25th, what would be exposed if that data element was available is a hash. So in our case, a SHA-256 hash, representing a person and the checkout history over time. So the ways of cracking that would be like through hash comparison. We have multiple pieces of data that go into the hash algorithm along with salt. And so somebody would need to know what all of those things were in combination in order to do hash comparison, which is the only known possible way of getting at a hash, which would then, tell them that these numbers, the best they would do is, I would know that this, not even barcode, but this bibliographic number checked out these titles. So, it's not, I don't think there is an exposure risk. Yeah.
Follow up though, like if that data is available to the public library for a specific user, then I'm not following how it wouldn't be theoretically available to somebody who hacked into the entire public library system. That doesn't make 100% sense to me.
So the table would be a de-identified hash. So this is letters and numbers that are persistent, but it doesn't. There's no table comparing it to any person. It's a one-way hash.
Right.
And then there's a record of the checkout history. So knowing, even if you were to get this table, as maybe the hackers got, there is no exposure available if you have a hash, unless you're able to somehow crack the SHA-256 encryption, which is, and even then, what is encoded is not a name, it's not a person, it's a number, and so they would then need something else in order to. I guess what I'm trying to express is that the level of complexity is beyond states, like a state entity to do something nefarious with that. Okay. And so
like more than a hospital would protect someone's social security number.
Right, yeah, we would not be, we don't have information about someone even in our ILS, other than the most basic information to maintain a relationship. So like we have the person's name and they have a barcode and we have address information, but we don't keep, other detailed information about users.
So this table would not be associated with the person.
Right.
In that way.
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to make sure we get to Cindy's question, but just briefly, I feel like just as a broad comment, I think obviously data and cybersecurity are becoming more and more important for libraries and cultural heritage institutions. And one thing we talk about in my classes is like, we often don't have a lot of training in library, for people who are working in those spaces. And obviously cybersecurity is a big concern, across all kinds of organizations and companies, and all kinds of are vulnerable in all kinds of ways. But it does seem important to have more people working in these spaces that know about data or to be taking it more seriously. And I think people are taking it more seriously, but yeah, it's really interesting to hear your perspective. But Cindy, I wanted to get to your question.
Well, Melanie, that's such a good point. And putting my broadband hat on, because I'm chair right now of an advocacy organization in DC for libraries. And I will say that there's a great move to try and get cybersecurity to be covered by that same E-rate discount that we get for broadband connectivity. And the FCC has agreed to a pilot, by the way. I don't know what the pilot's going to prove. We all know it's necessary. But you're absolutely right. Libraries are so vulnerable because they're under-resourced. But the kinds of complexities that David just described, I mean, they're so comforting in a way that, and there has been such a commitment on the part of libraries to anonymity when it comes to checkouts that they can't even do some of the things that would make the users' lives better, as David was describing. You know, you can't personalize like people are used to in the e-commerce space. I was thinking I've loved this conversation, and it just brings me back to my early days at Amazon. And I'm thinking, because we worked with all those original data sets with Ingram and Baker and Taylor. And I will say that what I think is so interesting, and it's a space that libraries have been slower to move into because we've had this history, this very structured MARC data, and all of the systems that are built for us to search and retrieve are MARC specific. Moving to the web was helpful, but we still had our library data in a particular format. And when you can combine and use all the different ways that data is described, for example, BISAC, which is flawed but got really interesting when Amazon started to need that data. Library of Congress data, the way that Ingram and Baker and Taylor have their own systems of parsing and using that data, user-provided data. You know, there are lots of instances of people wanting to tag stuff themselves and talk about what it's useful for. And then that user algorithm that was what am I trying to say? That was copyrighted, that was patented, that's the word I'm looking for, by Amazon in March of 1998, which is the people that use this, use that, people that read this, read that. That kind of algorithmic way of defining usage is so common now. I mean, it sounded like the cosine model was playing around with that a little bit. The same ideas that users can drive us to other things that matter. They know better than anybody what's related, and they can find more nuanced connections. All of this to say that I do think the combination of, just as actually Lucy was saying, the combination of manually and user-provided data and context that has existed in all different ways and systems, along with more structured data, metadata systems combined, can do a lot to tell us about data and usage and what things are about. And libraries have been at such a disadvantage because they haven't been able to do some of that or be as loose in their, aggregating all these different metadata systems. I'm sorry, this isn't really a question. It's an observation about how you guys are all circling around this big thing. And it's a really fun problem, but the best way to solve it is in the broadest possible way of looking at that data.
Can I respond to that? Yeah, of course. I also think, because Cindy mentioned like libraries have been at a disadvantage, and I think that's where we're starting to reach a really interesting point with AI and like things like ChatGPT becoming so widely available. Is I think that there's now a huge opportunity for libraries to start leading the way on alternative ways to make use of deep learning models and just machine learning in general for information discovery, because while library systems certainly aren't perfect, I don't think any information discovery system could be perfect. They are built to serve the public in a way that the big kind of state-of-the-art models that are out there are not. And so I think that the kind of concerns that, like we talked about with user privacy and things like that, like bring some of these things together, I think it will be really exciting to see what happens as more and more libraries start to experiment with ways to use this technology, because I think that we are in desperate need of information systems that surface complexity rather than try to reduce the response to a search query down to a single statement. And I think that's where libraries' strengths kind of lie in.
Yes, no, I completely agree with you. I think librarians are the experts. The reason I was hired as the first librarian is because they said librarians know how users look for books. Tell us, What is the way that users look for books? And then you get to tweak the system. Every time there's a miss search, look at the search logs every night. And when you see a miss, correct it. An alternative spelling, a different subject heading. It was that little back then. But but we know what users are looking for. We know how things are described, and we know what an author writes about.
Yeah, I'll just say that I think you're totally right, Cindy, in identifying that metadata is so key to so many of these conversations, and that metadata is so like siloed, and that there are these issues with it being proprietary. And like, yeah, Amazon has its own system, but they're doing their own thing, and that's where their value is. And they don't want people to be able to do like what they're doing. Yeah, I've been on this. I'm like always so frustrated that there's no work level persistent identifier, so we could connect all the different variations of Pride and Prejudice, for example. And I feel like there was an effort to do that, and then it died out. I still am trying to figure this out. So if anybody knows more, I'd love to talk to you.
I was on that committee. Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, we gotta have coffee. I'll buy you coffee. But like, it seems like it died because Amazon and each, company, et cetera, has its own system, and they didn't want, it's not in their.
They would have used it. They would have used it. The problem is it's way too complex, and the people trying to solve the problem weren't librarians. It was all the BISAC folk. It was the industry in New York City. That's where we were meeting to talk about this. And it was so obvious that it was needed. And there was the notion of the uniform title. So there was a kind of the way that libraries had tried to address it. But it gets complicated with digital formats. Where does that fit in? The group just couldn't resolve the complexity, and there wasn't enough leadership to keep it going.
Wow. Okay, I definitely want to hear more about that. I saw that there was a question in the chat, so maybe I'll read that and then we can go to you, or is it?
I was just gonna add something about
Okay.
librarians and the work.
Okay, go ahead.
Metadata librarians are not doing any better when it comes to figuring out how to describe works and come up with work level identifiers for things. Like, there's tons of different iterations of BigFrame right now, tossing around different classes for the work, and there's LRM and RBA have a work, and Wikidata has a work that's different from those. So I mean, industry is having trouble, but we're not doing better. So don't give us praise.
Okay. I want to talk more about that too. So Chance had a question in the chat. Can the panelists speak to the opportunities they see for libraries serving patrons better because of advances in machine learning? Who will benefit?
I'm happy to take. Oh yeah, I don't need to unmute. Sorry, I'm still adjusting to the owl. I would say, from my perspective, in some of the conversations that I've had with the work that I mentioned with DPLA and talking with public libraries and some of the rooms that Cindy's been in with some of our friends, all just to say that I think one of the aspects of this work that I think touches very much on what Chance's question was, but one that I see as a real opportunity is seeing the public library and also the university library as a place to develop AI literacy. So less about how we can use machine learning to enrich our discovery, but also really trying to foreground public programming, really patron-facing work to develop even an understanding of what GPT is, recognizing that there's a real spectrum of understanding literacy out there. There's been some really interesting work that I've seen a number of public libraries do, but I just wanted to mention that dimension of the work in case we go in other directions.
Well, and I think kind of going to some of the complexity you guys were talking about with like all these different representations of a work, if we can start opening up these different information systems more, I do think that's where machine learning is good at looking at really large scale at all these disparate things and starting to find similarities. And so it might not be 100% perfect, but it can look at a scale that it can look at a large scale much faster than any group of humans can. And so you might be able to start chipping away at some of that complexity by automating the kind of recognition of different versions of Pride and Prejudice just based on titles and variant titles that have very similar text. So yeah, Sharon actually just said could machine learning be applied to that thorny problem of entity matching and cross-platform persistent identifiers? So I think, yeah, it's really interesting. Were there other thoughts?
The AI literacy instruction definitely resonates and something we're talking about at my institution. It is interesting, like being a new librarian at this time and seeing a lot of the tools being rolled out, offered by vendors, often seem to me like solutions in search of a problem. Sort of, this is
yes, it drives me crazy. That's why I'm consulting right now. It's like, start with the problem that you're trying to solve. Don't start with the technology.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'm still in a wait and see type moment with a lot of these machine learning tools, but I just heard of a lot of great things here at this table.
Certainly literacy at the Seattle Public Library, we are looking into hiring an AI program manager who would be concerned with AI literacy. Yeah.
Interesting.
Sorry, unless anyone else has a question. I just have a billion questions. Initially in your talk, you talked about the bias being dynamic and also bias being like helpful and inevitable in some ways. I'm curious how, and maybe this is like not something you come across, but I'm curious how you're seeing those as intellectual implications versus practical implications. I think often in research and things like that, we think about like other people's worldviews and, you know, this and that, but at like the end of the day, like people are gonna like come up against things that are like actually harmful to them and aren't intellectual, but like people are just gonna deal with racism and sexism and homophobia. And I'm wondering, in terms of the bias that you're seeing, if you're coming against problems that I feel like have been talked about in terms of books, where it's like, this book uses the N-word, but we need to keep it for historical preservation, and that's really important for people to know, but it could be very hurtful to other people who are maybe not in the room, sort of making that call. I'm curious to your point about like machine learning and how it's just always going to have bias, and if we just say it has bias, I'm not saying that's what you said, but like if we acknowledge that they have bias, then like we'll be able to, sort of move through that. If you see that as more of an intellectual stance versus like an actual practical stance for the people who are going to be inherently seeing that bias more.
Yeah, I think, I mean, part of it, I think why I for so long have found like libraries and archives and museums and galleries like such an interesting space to work, is I feel like they kind of sit between that space of the intellectual and the practical, because I think it's hard to separate out those two when you're doing the work of trying to decide what to collect and how you're going to describe it. I will say, I think kind of what I've seen with the groups of librarians, archivists, and curators that I've worked with is a push to try to just keep updating terminology and not necessarily remove things. I do know in certain cases when things have been very inflammatory or like it doesn't reflect the language of the material, people will change things. But I think, I spoke with an archivist who worked with a lot of material that was relevant to the LGBTQ community in Scotland, and she was saying how her goal is to keep updating terminology so that, like you were saying, the people who are actually going to look for the material can search it with present day terminology. But at the same time, there are people who describe themselves in a particular way that in the past wasn't considered as harmful as it is today. And also, I mean, there are always going to be disagreements. Certain people will prefer different terms at different times. And so she felt that keeping the kind of like original terms that were in, say, like the first catalog description written for this material was important because it was a part of that history. And so by adding new terminology, you're kind of acknowledging this evolution of language and society and all of that. And I think to me, one of the interesting things coming out of kind of these conversations I've had is this idea that the metadata descriptions are works in progress, and trying to think about ways to communicate to the end user who has these more kind of practical concerns that they're not the end all be all, and they're like meant to be this kind of initial almost like an MVP when it comes to discovery of like, how can we make as much discoverable as possible so that other people can come in and do more research. And if they find new things, then we can add more information to the description. But at the end of the day, like with resource constraints in all these institutions, people would love to spend more time describing them, but they just can't. And so it's a lot about thinking about that discoverability, which is why I think just keeping the terminology updated, it's important. And it's also just something that is going to be continuous because language is going to continue evolving. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but
yeah.
Okay.
I have a similar question that's like kind of alongside. Like I've noticed in my work, I do entity management in libraries, and I also do quite a bit of cataloging. And like OCLC and BIOP use machine learning to like deduplicate entities in their database. And like the Library of Congress and Cornell have created a bot that goes in and deduplicates things with Wikidata, and it's really cool. And I work on a project that helps address errors with that bot.
Okay.
And a lot of the errors that seem to be happening with those things are for like marginalized groups or for places that are places where white people don't live. And
yes.
That just sounds so closet.
Yeah,
exactly. It is classified. It is not a surprise. It didn't surprise anyone. And you know, we go in and we fix those things, and you know, it's like, oh, the first Japanese woman lawyer ever, you know, to name authority records in the Library of Congress. Name authority file. Surprise no one, right?
Yeah.
So we have to go in and we do these fixes, and it's great that like Cornell has made this bot, and it's glorious. But like machine learning is kind of going through and making descriptions about things based on information and learning from information that is racist. And like I'll be cataloging a book that's in my science backlog, and it's actually a scientific racism book, for instance. And it's by a political scientist, and it's not science at all. It's saying like, you know, so like, and AI doesn't catch those things.
No, it doesn't.
And so then, you know, administrators and libraries see all these things published about how promising AI is. These things aren't talked about, and they're decreasing cataloging budgets and not having human eyeballs on this stuff. So like, I'm wondering how we can, as sort of librarians and scholars, sort of emphasize how powerful the tool machine learning is and how great it is, and also emphasize how important it is that like humans are still the ones writing these math problems, because all it is just math, right?
Well, I think that's where the kind of opportunity I was saying that I think libraries have here is leading in this space, because people, and again, I'm generalizing, but most data science and computer science curriculums don't require you to think about history in a way that is really necessary if you're looking at large-scale information access, and you want to do that in a way that isn't just perpetuating the state that things are in now, or were historically, because you know data is old the moment it gets recorded, and so I think that being really cautious about simply adopting models that are claimed to be out there is important, and being aware of the fact that the way bias is measured in these evaluations of deep learning models is very, very simplified, and it's not going to catch the kind of things that you're talking about. And so I think this is where I think there is a huge opportunity for people like you who are really aware of these things to go, okay, well, how can we build data sets that would train a model to pick up on those things? Because we can build data sets in a way that isn't just about what's easily available and what can quickly be scraped. There are other ways to create data sets, and I mean, libraries have done that for years, right? Like catalogs or data sets. And so I think that we desperately need models that are built on data sets that were created with exactly the kind of problems you're talking about in mind. And that just doesn't exist in the machine learning world yet, but I'm hopeful because there's a lot of interest in, libraries, archives, and museums to use these things that will change. But I think awareness is huge right now too, of just recognizing that these models aren't as good as people want you to think they are. I think that's right, because it's also possible to train models on like expert annotated data. So you could have a bunch of examples of like, how would a librarian like describe some kind of material like this? Because I feel like earlier when you pointed out the problem with these general tools, I think that is like a big problem. Because if you're just using like a summarization model, then it's just going to summarize the racist text, but that's not what we want. We want it to do something different. So yeah, I think that is the tension. There was a question in the chat from Temi who said, Sarah Ahmed reminds us that diversity work is most complex in its attempts to modify or transform institutions. I'm wondering how the panel is thinking about the ways all this data helps to address other structures, such as leadership and representation in the publishing industry or in museums. It's a really good question. I don't think I have a great answer, but the first thing that comes to mind, I showed that data visualization from that study that showed that like 95% of authors published by the Big Five were written by white authors. And Richard So and another collaborator just recently published like a follow-up because that original article was like written pretty soon after the summer of 2020. And it was in this moment where they were asking, there's this like big push to publish more diverse books, but is it going to last? And their follow-up was about how all of these, like a lot of big names in publishing, a lot of like Lisa Lucas at Pantheon, I forget where else she was working, but have been recently like fired, and that a lot of the progress that had been made has already like rolled back. And so I think it's kind of depressing and disappointing that we have a lot of data, we have a lot of information about how not diverse publishing is, and yet it hasn't seemed like it's made any kind of long-term change at this point. I don't know if other people have thoughts, but I'm not saying that's not possible.
Yeah, I think the data being produced by that IMLS project gives a good sense of what stories might be missing that the publishing industry is not pushing out, but in terms of addressing structural inequities that exist within the industry itself, I don't think the data is necessarily going to get at that.
I mean, there was like a PEN America, I think, like there was a survey, there was some kind of audit of like who works in publishing that also showed like how predominantly white it is. And I think that data is really useful. And actually that study by Richard So was also used in like some PEN like reporting. So, and I've taken that, like, I feel like that's some digital humanities work that has had more real world like impact than any other work that I've encountered. So I think the data can be used as like evidence to try to work toward change, but it's going to take more than the data alone, I think. And I think this is where technology it is just such a tool. It's not kind of good or bad in of itself, because there are also a lot of ways that like alternative options for publishing have given people different platforms to use. And so if we can start, it's kind of like community archives versus like the National Archives. Like if you can start to create data sets that draw on these more kind of localized organizations or institutions, then perhaps there are ways to more collaboratively start to address this. I don't know if that gets quite at the leadership part of things, but I think you know, if you look at like fan fiction, for example, you get a lot of different representations of characters that would be way different than what you're seeing in mainstream publishing. And so if you can start to try to think about ways to, I guess, leverage both of those data sources, then maybe that could be one path forward.
One other thing I might add. Are we good?
Oh, I think it was me after all. Well, I take full accountability. Yeah, I mean, I also think there's a broader conversation here around machine learning, questions of automation, practices of cataloging, whose jobs are at risk and whose jobs that we're going to assume will be essential, so to speak. And I think that's like submerged under this entire conversation and really sort of, I think, pressing and also like ways that are difficult to get leadership to talk about oftentimes at libraries. I would also say that, you know, at least my time working at the Library of Congress, recognizing the questions of diversity and how it emerges and who has various staff positions in leadership is also a really fraught one. It reminds me of the broader, like the anecdote around the library that I find rather powerful, sort of longitudinally about the history of the organization is that, you know, I know why the caged bird sings. The Maya Angelou memoir is actually a quote from a Paul Laurence Dunbar poem from when he was later in life, was working as a shelver at the Library of Congress and using that as an opportunity to perhaps reflect on some of the questions of diversity at that institution, I think intersects in meaningful ways with questions of whose jobs might be automated away with these ideas of machine learning and cataloging. And so just offering that as another way in which these questions of the panel might come back and intersect with labor.
And can I just say, I appreciate you struggling with this question and grappling with it, because I think it's important, only because I see the synergies with those who control the technology itself. So this conversation for me is not just about transforming the publishing institutions or museums or archives, but also is how there is kind of like a similar thing happening in the tech space as well. It's about control. It's about, yes, we need alternative possibilities to kind of like chip away. But if the actual superstructure, which, you know, controls the data or holds information, and, you know, if it's about Amazon Web Services at the end of the day, then we do need to have this conversation seriously about institutions, even if we're going to come up with alternatives to kind of like transform the everyday experience, if that makes sense.
I think that's totally right. If nobody asked the question, I was going to ask, like, how is the AI hype cycle connected to the work you're doing or the cultural heritage space? And I think you're right that these things are aligning and happening in various fields and domains as well. Yeah, I had an experience recently. I was at a panel and the researcher was talking about how AI was going to take everybody's job in the room in the next 10 years. And they're on the board of OpenAI. And so I thought, well, of course you're going to push that narrative. And meanwhile, I had just been having a conversation actually with Lori Allen at the Library of Congress. There was a panel that she was on and someone had asked about, you know, concerns around people's jobs being kind of automated out of existence. And she just said, we're nowhere close to that being a concern because there is such a huge backlog of material that needs to be documented and managed and provided access to. And kind of, as I was saying about some of these deep learning models, is like their sophistication is really overhyped. And so I think that there is a recognition outside of, there is a recognition in tech circles, but I think particularly outside of them, with people that have actually tried to start using some of these tools for information discovery, that they can't take over describing new heritage material. And I think it's great to think about like kind of initial metadata generation and how, you know, looking at the date on a document or the author and things like that could be quickly automated. But in terms of actually trying to contextualize the material or think about, you know, subject headings and how different people might actually come to find the collection material. Machine learning can do some things, but it hasn't reached a point where it really is like close to taking all these people away from, or taking all these jobs away from people that are doing the manual work today. So we have a few minutes left. Is there any last minute questions or thoughts?
Yes, thanks everyone. I'm wondering how to word this a bit, but I wonder, especially for Connor and David, if you could speak to, and Lucy as well, I guess, whoever wants to jump in, opportunities for problem solving, especially thinking about your example of missing women in archives and collections. You know, in some languages, there's a construction of someone's last name and daughter, or you know, an easy way to tell that there's a woman associated. I wonder if there might be, with LLMs and AI, some way to easily say, you know, we know this writer was active in this period, or, you know, other examples where someone can be brought in who was previously missing in the metadata or other collections.
I don't know. I'm not. I don't claim to be a AI or machine learning expert, but you know, maybe some kind of named entity recognition module. So the one that comes to mind is Spacey, which is a Python for doing named entity recognition. So maybe running that against the whole corpus for as a way of identifying named entities that appear in the text that maybe. And then doing some kind of like inverse document frequency on this those named entities in order to identify, you know, like, oh gosh, this person's mentioned like 25 times and not in other documents. They seem super important in this document.
No, I'm out of my wheelhouse for sure.
Because I will say, so my PhD, I was looking at building models to kind of do this sort of thing, if I'm understanding correctly. So trying to actually identify different types of biases in language and start to investigate whether there are these types of linguistic patterns. And that's where I think it was kind of surprising to me that as I was looking at a lot of work around bias in machine learning and AI, that there hadn't been a lot of just trying to understand bias. It was more about kind of, it was a little bit more reactive than proactive in a way of saying, we need to remove this, we need to minimize it. And so I think there's definitely a huge opportunity to investigate this more at large scale of these types of linguistic patterns. And of course, across different languages, it will vary quite a bit, but actually designing models to identify biases and working with people who are familiar with the data and already know some of the ways that it might manifest. I think, yeah, I feel like I'm only scratching the surface of that. So there's definitely a lot to do. I don't know if it's like the work you did with Ashna or like augmenting metadata from collections.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are a lot of interesting opportunities. I think this touches on what Lucy was saying as well, to think about metadata structures that are more rigid like MARC and how we can enrich those with sort of alternative documentation, or I don't even know exactly the right way of putting it. What I'm thinking of is with Chronicling America, the digitized newspaper corpus of the Library of Congress, but a lot of really, really fascinating work about developing title essays for various newspaper titles and having experts contribute them, and also like finding those interrelationships between the title essays and the sort of more formal MARC records, I think is one interesting sort of speculative way of moving this kind of work forward. So thanks for that.
Okay, so I think we're out of time. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here.